Okay, so today is Wednesday, the 15th of February. I was going to ask, how was your Valentine's? Good? So-so? Apple? Black Tuesday? No? Okay. It was just a regular day. Any other day. I spent Valentine's with my cat and my dog and my parrot. We had a nice evening together watching a movie. A really ridiculous movie. Anyways, so to the lecture. This is a slide. Slide 15 is where we stopped on Monday. And I just want to do a quick review of this because the next slide is also related to this one. And so we were talking about the difference between lipid-soluble hormones, and water-soluble hormones or chemical messengers, or those that are too big to pass through the plasma membrane. So, those that require a receptor attached to the plasma membrane, okay, so like we see here, is very important for hormones that cannot pass through that plasma membrane. So the water solubles and the ones that are too big, they rely on a receptor. Okay? So really important to remember. So they rely on a receptor because they cannot pass through that, diffuse through that plasma membrane. And then after it attaches to the receptor, it then causes changes inside the cell, and so it causes what we would call intracellular reaction. And we will go through some examples in a moment, okay? Now, on the other hand, okay, back up again real quick. So this is going to be causing an intracellular reaction where the hormone binds to a receptor on the plasma membrane. This next slide is talking about receptors that are inside the cell, not bound to the membrane at all. And so these receptors are for those small lipid-soluble hormones that are able to diffuse through the plasma membrane and then bind to the receptor inside the cell. Okay? So that's a big difference. Okay, so the lipid-soluble ones, and they have to be pretty small to be able to diffuse through like it's doing. Then it still binds to a receptor. The receptor is still specific. Okay? And so when this happens, essentially, here's the key. This is what happens when we have a hormone enter through the plasma membrane, bind to a receptor inside. It's going to cause an interaction with enzymes, or it can actually cause direct changes to the DNA and can cause a certain gene to be transcribed and then translated into protein, and that protein then has its own function as a result. So this can have a direct effect on the DNA, reading DNA, or activating a gene. Okay, so some examples of intracellular or hormones that bind to intracellular receptors: thyroid hormone, testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, aldosterone, and cortisol. All of these down here, they're in their own special class of hormones, which we will be talking about in a minute. And then thyroid hormone's kind of on it's separate. It's not related to these. But all of these hormones pass through the plasma membrane and bind to a receptor. You should definitely know that. As compared, backing up again, as compared to those that are large or water-soluble, molecules like epinephrine and norepinephrine are going to bind to receptors on the plasma membrane. Okay? So you will need to know those differences. Now here is a table, and yeah, I'm just going to read it. It says, you will be expected to know the highlighted hormones, where they are produced, the target tissue, and whether or not these hormones bind to receptors and activate G proteins. Now, we haven't talked about G proteins yet. That's the next thing we're going to talk about, and We'll be talking a lot about G protein, so you might get sick of it. But, so when you look at this list, so luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone. So a lot of these do have abbreviations. So luteinizing hormone is LH. Follicle stimulating hormone is FSH. Prolactin is often found as PL. Then oxytocin, calcitonin. We've heard of calcitonin before. It's one of the hormones that helps regulate blood calcium levels, along with parathyroid hormone. Okay, those two are involved with blood calcium levels, and then epinephrine. And so this table is quite nice because it tells you, okay, luteinizing hormone is made in the anterior pituitary. Well, what does it work upon? The ovary or the testes. So males and females both produce luteinizing hormone, and it works on their gonads. Okay, so ovary or testes is basically the functional equivalent between males and females. If we look down here, oxytocin, posterior pituitary. As a reminder, the posterior pituitary is directly connected to the hypothalamus, which is under neuronal control, not hormonal control. It's also called neurohypophysis. That's the posterior pituitary. And the oxytocin has a direct effect on the uterus. And if you remember, we talked about the oxytocin has an effect on causing those smooth muscle contractions of the uterus during labor and childbirth. Remember, your calcitonin is from the thyroid gland. Your parathyroid hormone is from the parathyroid gland. They both affect the bone. But we also know, if we remember, it also can affect the kidney and also can have effects, where else? This is regulating calcium. We can regulate calcium in 3 different places. The bone, we're either depositing or taking calcium out, or we can get rid of excess calcium in the kidneys, in our urine. And then there was one other place where we could regulate calcium. You guys remember? Like you can increase the absorption of calcium in a place. Where do we absorb nutrients? In our intestines. Yeah. So it also works, we'll just say intestines. It may not spell it right. But these are 3 places where it can affect calcium absorption or lack of absorption, getting rid of extra. And then last, epinephrine on this one, the adrenal gland, specifically the medulla. And the medulla of the adrenal gland is also under neuronal control. Okay? So the medulla, is neuronal, and then the cortex of the adrenal gland is completely opposite. So we'll talk about that when we'll look at these different organs. Okay, the next slide. Here's where we get into talking about G proteins. And it may take a little bit of time to get used to this, but this is one of the pictures that is in the handout I provided to you on Moodle. And I think it's kind of helpful because it takes you through the steps of what's happening with a G protein. Why do we need a G protein? Okay, so we're just going to start at number 1 over here. Oh, why is this not drawing red? Oh, that's just not pretty. Okay, so here's number 1. What happens? Well, we have a hormone that is bound to a receptor right there. Okay? So once the hormone binds to the receptor, what's next? We have a set of 3 little molecules combined. So gamma, beta, and alpha together. They usually all sit together. So if we look down here, this is what it's like at rest. Where all of those subunits are together. That's our G protein. But when a receptor binds to when a hormone binds to a receptor, the alpha subunit here moves away. Okay? So it dissociates away from the other subunits of the G protein. And so then the next step, this alpha subunit gets nice and cozy with a calcium channel. So these are calcium ions. Okay, so when that alpha subunit binds, gets cozy with that calcium channel, it opens the gates. So the gates open, calcium comes in, and then look at this. Calcium binds to this purple structure, and this purple structure is calmodulin. Okay, see if I can spell that. Calmodulin is this purple guy. So the calcium binds to calmodulin. Okay, and then what's next? We go to number 3 over here. So now, calmodulin, just so you know, it produces a response to the hormone inside the cell. And it can be all sorts of different hormones follow this pathway. So I can't say the general response for all of them because they will have different responses. Okay, so the third step, this alpha subunit over here, I forgot to mention, is bound to GTP. Okay, down here, the alpha subunit gets rid of one of those phosphates from GTP. So T means triphosphate, so I think it's guanylene triphosphate. So at this third step, it gets rid of a phosphate, so now it's diphosphate. So now it's GDP, and that causes that alpha subunit to break away from that calcium channel. And it joins its friends to make a complete G protein again with your gamma, beta, and alpha subunits. And so when alpha leaves, the gates close, no more calcium can go in, and our hormone disassociates from the receptor. So when all of those things happen, we are back at rest. Okay? So we have our G protein right here. All the subunits are together. The calcium channel is closed, and there's nothing bound to the receptor. So when a hormone does bind to a receptor, it causes changes in the G protein that's bound to the inside of the plasma membrane that can then cause changes inside the cell. You get rid of a phosphate from the GTP. That causes alpha subunit to go back, rejoin the G protein, and basically reset itself. Okay, so this is a little bit more about G protein, and this one is using, let me see, this is using a specific example. Okay, so the specific example for this activation is glucagon. Okay, glucagon is a very important molecule, and so activating G protein, glucagon has membrane-bound receptors, so that means that the glucagon is either water-soluble or it's large, so it needs a receptor to bind to. Okay, so when glucagon binds to its specific receptor, that alpha subunit we saw in the previous slide scoots over, so it disassociates from beta and gamma, and GTP, so T is triphosphate, okay, just to remember. It's not going to get it all. Okay. So GTP binds to it. Then the alpha subunit binds to what we call adenylate cyclase, and it's going to activate it. So this is not something we saw on the previous slide. In the next slide, we'll see some more examples, okay? So when the alpha subunit of the G protein binds to the adenylate cyclase, it increases the product, or what's called cyclic AMP. And this, the next slide will show the picture, okay? And if you increase cyclic AMP, that is going to activate certain enzymes inside the cell. And so all of this the whole purpose of this is to ultimately break down glycogen from liver cells. Glycogen is a shorter-term energy storage molecule, and when it's stored as glycogen in the liver, but when it receives this signal, it releases it from the liver cells as glucose, and then it's traveling through the bloodstream, and you have that glucose available to make energy with your oxygen. Okay, so here we go. And unfortunately, if this was on the PowerPoint instead of this tablet, these lovely circles would pop up at the appropriate time. That's okay. So here is the actual picture example of what we just saw or read on the previous slide. So this is talking about glucagon again. So because we're going through this example about the glucagon receptor, or the glucagon molecule itself, you should definitely know this example for upcoming quizzes or exams. So the first step is you have glucagon. Here's our glucagon right here. It binds to the receptor. We had a G protein, but when it binds to the receptor, our alpha subunit scoots on over. It disassociates. Okay? And so that alpha subunit that's activated, it scoots on over. It has GTP bound to it. Okay? You can't see it in the picture, but it's activated. GTP binds to it, and then it activates where is it? Where number 2. Okay, so yes, it activates adenylate cyclase, and it converts, so this would be our adenylate cyclase right here, this purple guy. Can't spell, I'm sorry. And when it does that, it allows ATP to be converted to cyclic AMP. That's what CAMP stands for, is cyclic AMP. I cannot draw, sorry. And so when you activate that cyclic AMP, you have two options, or two things that can occur. Okay? So one, if cyclic AMP is activated, the third step here is then it activates protein kinases. You can see them right here. So if we activate protein kinases, what are they doing? Okay, the protein kinases, basically, it activates some enzymes, specific enzymes that help break down glycogen. Breaks down glycogen, it releases glucose into the bloodstream. Bam! So this might happen, let's say if your blood sugar is too low, you may have you will have glucagon released in order to increase your blood sugar levels. Okay? So we have this whole reaction here, which is to increase glucose and release glucose that's stored as glucagon in the liver. Okay, then the last step is to inactivate the cyclic AMP. The way it's inactivated over here is we use phosphodiesterase. The ACE implies that it is an enzyme, and that is going to convert cyclic AMP to AMP. So it's taking a part of that molecule apart. So in a nutshell, what's happening? Glucagon is released when your blood sugar is low. It activates the G protein and ultimately leads to glucagon releasing glucose into the bloodstream to increase blood sugar levels. Remembering that glucagon is stored in the liver. So you need enzymes like, let's see. Doesn't say enzymes to break down that glucagon into sugar, glucose. Okay, another example here a little bit more complicated. You okay over there? I said, are you okay over there?
Yes.
Okay. I know this is riveting stuff. All right, another example, and we're talking about prostaglandins this time. So first of all, we'll just look at this side here. This whole reaction that we're going to go through is based on epinephrine. So epinephrine is right here, this lovely hormone that is bound to the receptor. And specifically, this is with smooth muscle. Okay? So, let's follow the sequence of events. Okay, so epinephrine binds to the receptor. And specifically, this receptor is found on this plasma membrane of smooth muscle. So it binds to the receptor. When it binds to the receptor, it activates our G protein, our gamma, beta, and alpha subunits. When it activates, alpha scoots on over. Okay? Alpha is always the one that scoots over. And that activated alpha then binds with what we call phospholipase C. This is that right here, phospholipase C. And that causes a series, you have two things that can occur. Okay, so that phospholipase and phosphodiinositol, some of these things are not as important as others, leads to conversion of chemicals. So what's the final outcome? Number 4, this molecule here, IP3, so inositol triphosphate, causes calcium, so this is the important part, causes calcium ions to be released from the endoplasmic reticulum, or opens calcium channels in the plasma membrane. So this is smooth muscle, and the ultimate effect of epinephrine on this smooth muscle is to cause calcium to be released from the endoplasmic reticulum or calcium channels to open and allow calcium to come in. We have already learned that calcium has a direct effect on the ability of a muscle to contract. Remember that? Calcium binds to little special thing on the troponin trypomyosin complex, causes it to shift so that the myosin can actually attach. So calcium is really important in muscle contraction. Okay? And so calcium, there's 2 places you get it, from the endoplasmic reticulum or from channels outside of the cell. And then over here we have this molecule diacylglycerol, DAG. And so what does DAG do? It's basically regulating an enzyme that makes prostaglandin, which is another hormone. Okay? And so if DAG is also stimulated, it is going to regulate proteins that make prostaglandin. Okay? So not only are you ultimately causing the release of calcium, you are also producing prostaglandins. Okay? So you're doing 2 things here as a result of epinephrine on smooth muscle. Okay? So the response is, well, with both of these things, both with prostaglandin and with this extra calcium, we are going to accomplish smooth muscle contraction. And so prostaglandins themselves, even without the extra calcium, prostaglandins are known to cause smooth muscle contractions. In fact, folks, semen from the ejaculate actually contains prostaglandins, which can cause smooth muscle contractions in the female's reproductive tract. Okay? And it's kind of like a old wives' tale. For example, if a woman, she's very pregnant, she's close to full term. By that time, most women are like so done with being pregnant, they just want the baby out already. One of the things they tell you to do is go have intercourse with your significant other because there's prostaglandins in the semen, which could trigger contractions of her uterus. So prostaglandins do have a really important effect on smooth muscle contraction because the uterus is made out of smooth muscle. Okay, now we're going to talk about a different type of response. So receptors that directly alter activity of enzymes inside the cell. So this example we're going to talk about is atrial natriuretic hormone, abbreviated ANH. Okay, atrial. Where do you think we might find that hormone? Where is it perhaps produced? Heart. Yeah. So atrial natriuretic hormone right here binds to its big, lovely red receptor. And once it binds to that receptor, it activates this green molecule here that I'm circling in red. And so in this green molecule is guanylate cyclase. All right? It becomes activated. So when the hormone binds to the receptor, it activates guanylate cyclase, which then converts GTP to cyclic GMP. Okay? And so what is cyclic GMP? If you look over here, it is a mediator that mediates. Okay, if you're trying to define a term, you never use the term when you're trying to define the term. I'm just saying. So when it says it's an intracellular mediator that mediates the response of the cell, they could have worded that a little more. They could have worded that differently, I think. So basically, this cyclic GMP kind of controls what is going on as a response to this hormone inside the cell. So, cyclic GMP, there's two things that can occur. Right here, first, you can have cyclic GMP. It increases sodium excretion by the kidney and therefore increases urine volume. So, atrial natriuretic hormone, one response is to get rid of excess sodium ions. So if you're excreting excess sodium out into your urine, water is going to follow. So it's going to increase your urine volume. Okay? If you're increasing your urine volume, you're getting rid of extra fluid in your body, and that's going to cause a decrease in your blood pressure. Okay, so atrial natriuretic hormone was triggered when there was too much blood in the system, and one way to get rid of that extra fluid is to get rid of it through the kidneys. And it will reduce that fluid in your bloodstream and therefore reduce blood pressure. Okay, another effect over here, phosphodiesterase, has the ability to inactivate cyclic GMP, and it stops the process. So the response is a pretty good response. It's important to know if atrial natriuretic hormone is released, what is going to happen? What's the final response? I don't need you to know every little step, but I do need you to know what happens as a consequence. Okay, so if atrial natriuretic hormone is released, ultimately that causes sodium to be excreted out in the kidneys, which then, if we follow concentration gradients, water is going to follow the sodium. That's going to give you a larger volume of urine that you will excrete, and that will decrease your overall water content in your body a bit, decrease your blood pressure, which is what triggered this hormone to be released in the first place. Okay, next slide. Another one of those. You need to know the highlighted hormone, where they're produced, target tissue, and the fact that these particular hormones bind to receptors inside. Okay? So All these other ones, these examples like atrial natriuretic hormone, prostaglandins, how we activate those, all of these are using G proteins, okay? And so this next set that we will talk about are not going to use G proteins. So no G proteins here. They're going to work in a different way. Okay, so hormones that you'll need to know: insulin, made in the pancreas, growth hormone, prolactin, growth factors, and there's various growth factors, and there's your atrial natriuretic hormone, which is interesting. Did I screw that? Maybe. Yeah, this one does not have a G protein, so this one should have been in the next one. Sorry. No G protein here. Okay, let me make sure we're clear on that. Okay, so, and I told you guys wrong. There is a hormone that's released by the heart, but the atrial natriuretic one is not it. I am sorry for the mistake. I'm going to make sure I correct that. Atrial natriuretic is made at the kidney level. My apologies. There is a hormone from the heart. We haven't gotten there. So I'm sorry for the confusion. So please remember, atrial natriuretic hormone is from the kidney, which would make sense if we are excreting extra sodium to increase our urine volume. Insulin, pancreas, is made in the pancreas, and the job of insulin is to basically have glucose taken up by cells, and therefore that decreases your glucose levels in your blood. Growth hormone and prolactin are both made in your anterior pituitary. Very often growth hormone is abbreviated GH. Prolactin, I think we saw that one before, is PL. And then we saw atrial natriuretic hormone. Okay, so these are going to have different responses. Oh, not done yet. So some more hormones. And these are what we would call steroid hormones. They all have this very similar structure to them. There's 4 rings, just like a cholesterol molecule has, but then just there's a few functional groups off of those 4 rings that are different. So all of these guys are steroid hormones. Definitely need to know them. So testosterone, made in the testes for males, progesterone, and estrogen. Yay, women, made in the ovary. And then we have 2 that are made in the adrenal cortex. So the cortex is the outermost layer. Okay, so like if we draw a really awful adrenal gland, here's the center. The center we call the medulla. And the outermost layer, is the cortex. So the medulla, I don't know if you remember, is under neuronal control. The cortex is not. Okay? So you have the nervous system controlling the medulla, and the cortex is controlled by other hormones. So there is a difference between those 2 sections in the adrenal gland. And so we will be talking about these guys. Okay, intracellular receptors. So intra means these receptors are inside the cell. Okay? And so when a hormone passes through the plasma membrane and binds to a receptor inside the cell, it's going to have direct effects on activities inside the cell. For example, like activating certain genes, which will then create a protein and have a response, okay, to whatever a particular hormone was released in the first place. So, as it says here, when it binds, it activates certain genes, and it leads to transcription and then translation. So if you remember transcription, you're transcribing DNA into mRNA. And then translation, you are translating that genetic code into proteins, or protein code, okay? And so these proteins that are made as a result to hormones that bind to intracellular receptors are able to produce a response fairly quickly. Not as quick as other hormones because it first has to go to the nucleus, it has to turn on the right gene, it has to make the mRNA, and then it has to go through this whole protein synthesis process. So it can take a little while for the effects of hormones that are activated this way to work. So as it says, there is a latent period, several hours of latent period possibly, because time is required for this process to occur. And so what limits this process that's inside the cell, it is limited by the breakdown of the receptor hormone complex. So if the hormone releases from the receptor, it stops the process. So if it breaks off, disassociates, it stops the process. But as long as there is a hormone bound to that receptor, the process will continue. Okay? So two particular hormones, estrogen and testosterone, they will pass through the plasma membrane. They bind to an intracellular receptor, but then they have different responses. Okay? And so different, for example, they're using puberty, the fun time in our lives. They will have different effects on males and females. So a lot of estrogen is going to be produced, and that leads to a lot of the secondary sex characteristics that happen during puberty. And then testosterone is the one that is produced mainly in men and will produce those secondary sex characteristics in them. By the way, there's a small amount of estrogen in males' bodies and a small amount of testosterone in females' bodies. Totally normal. Okay. Going to an easy slide here. Functions of the endocrine system. And we've kind of talked about a few hormones. We talked about one that helps regulate water balance. We've talked about one that stimulate secondary sex characteristics, and other ones as well. I just can't think of them right now. Oh, smooth muscle contraction, prostaglandins. Okay, so functions involved with metabolism and tissues maturing. So growth hormone is one that would affect that. Ion regulation, there's a bunch that are involved with ion regulation. Water balance, there is as well. Immune system regulation, heart rate and blood pressure regulation, controlling blood glucose and other nutrients. That was an example we looked at. What happens with glucagon and what happens with insulin. And these two guys are what we would call antagonists because insulin tells the cells to take sugar in. Glucagon causes stored sugar in the liver to be broken down and released into the blood. So they have opposite effects. Glucagon increases blood sugar. Insulin decreases blood sugar. Also has control of reproductive functions like our previous slide. Estrogen and testosterone were mentioned. Uterine contractions and milk release. So uterine contractions is oxytocin. Milk release is prolactin. All right, so talking about some specific glands now, getting more specific now. We have talked about before how the nervous system and the endocrine system can interact with each other. Sometimes they work together. Basically, they're part of the same structure or organ. Like the posterior pituitary is controlled by the nervous system. And like the adrenal medulla is also controlled by the nervous system. So we're going to talk about hypothalamus first. The hypothalamus is just this random region here. Let's use a darker color so we can see that easier. So the hypothalamus is just kind of this region of brain right before you hit that infundibulum, that little stalk that holds the pituitary gland. And so the hypothalamus regulates what pituitary releases. And if you remember, the hypothalamus secretes what we call releasing hormones. And those releasing hormones basically just travel down the infundibulum to the anterior pituitary and tell it to release a specific hormone. So as an example, the hypothalamus could release growth hormone releasing hormone, which sounds kind of silly, but the growth hormone releasing hormone would then travel down that little infundibulum to the anterior pituitary, and it tells the anterior pituitary to release growth hormone. Just kind of silly. But that's one way the hypothalamus controls the release of hormones from the pituitary. And that example I gave you was specific for the anterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary is different because it is essentially connected to the hypothalamus. It's under the control of the hypothalamus directly in the nervous system. So posterior pituitary is different. You don't need releasing hormones for that. So remember that there's definitely a difference there. Anterior pituitary produces 9 major hormones. Interesting. And so they're important with body functions, and they also affect other endocrine glands and will tell them to secrete or stop secreting a particular hormone. So, looking more closely at the pituitary gland, anterior and posterior pituitary, I've mentioned it multiple times, so we're going to look at it more closely. You will not need to identify anything. You do need to know that there's an anterior and a posterior portion, and the major differences. I'm not going to ask you these different regions because that's just not incredibly important for what we're learning right now. So, first of all, posterior pituitary is also known as the neurohypophysis. Okay, so it definitely has it's innervated and controlled by the nervous system. And it does secrete hormones, specifically neurohormones. Okay, and there are different types of hormones. Our anterior pituitary, the other term used for that is the adenohypophysis. Okay, and the anterior pituitary is the one that receives those releasing hormones from the hypothalamus. Okay, it is not directly controlled by the nervous system. Big difference. It does have 3 different areas. Don't need to worry about it. It is regulated by the hypothalamus, as I mentioned, by releasing hormones. Oh, there we go. By releasing hormones instead of the nervous system. Okay. So we're going to talk about releasing hormones now. And in fact, there are also inhibiting hormones. And these are all, releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones are all coming from our hypothalamus. Okay, guys, wait 4 more minutes. Don't yawn. It's contagious. Okay. So, first of all, a class of hormones. They're called tropins or tropic hormones. These hormones help regulate the secretion of other hormones. Okay? So tropins help control the release of other hormones and other glands. So, an important thing to note, all anterior pituitary hormones are tropins. And if you remember from the previous slide, there are 9 hormones made in the anterior pituitary. All of those hormones go on to affect other endocrine glands in the body, okay, and stimulate them to release hormones, for example. So, releasing hormones, the releasing hormones are coming from the hypothalamus. Always remember that. So, some examples. GHRH is growth hormone releasing hormone. That's going to be released from the hypothalamus. It travels down the infundibulum to the anterior pituitary. which then tells the anterior pituitary to start releasing growth hormone. Okay? Which just seems like a really long process to get growth hormone released, but that's how it's done. Okay? The next one, thyrotropin releasing hormone. That's going to be released from our hypothalamus, and it tells our anterior pituitary to release TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone. This is a really important hormone. Okay? And so abbreviated TSH. And if you ever get a blood test or they check your thyroid levels, you'll see the TSH on your blood report. The next one, CRH, so corticotropin releasing hormone. This one's really interesting because this one goes to the anterior pituitary and it produces adrenocorticotropic hormone. This hormone is going to travel through the bloodstream and it affects the cortex of the adrenal gland. That's where you have your the hormones in that class. Okay. More on the releasing hormones. Then we have gonadotropin releasing hormone, so GnRH, and this still travels down the infundibulum to the anterior pituitary, and it releases two different hormones from the anterior pituitary. So gonadotropin releasing hormone stimulates the release of follicle stimulating hormone and the release of luteinizing hormone. Okay? So gonadotropin releasing hormone affects and causes the release of two hormones from your anterior pituitary. Then we have prolactin releasing hormone. I love these releasing hormones because it has the name of the hormone involved, and so you don't really have to think too hard about what the hormone is ultimately going to be. So prolactin releasing hormone is going to cause your anterior pituitary to release prolactin. And we just finish this slide and we'll be done, okay? There are inhibiting hormones as well. So we have a whole set of releasing hormones. We also have a set of inhibiting hormones. Growth hormone inhibiting hormone. And that specifically has kind of a common name of somatostatin. And what this does is it tells your anterior pituitary to stop or decrease the release of growth hormone. So somatostatin, causes a decrease in the amount. Oh, no. No, what did I do? Wait, I think I can get back to this. It's still recording. Okay, yeah, so somatostatin causes the decrease in growth hormone. Last one, prolactin inhibiting hormone causes the decrease in the amount of prolactin being released, which means a decrease in the amount of breast milk. Okay, thank you for staying for that last little tidbit, and I hope you guys have a great